The concert hall buzzed with excitement as hundreds of people filed through the grand entrance. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the velvet seats below. Tonight was special. Marcus Wellington, the world-famous singer with 3 platinum albums and sold-out shows across 5 continents, was performing at the prestigious Harmony Theater. His voice had made millions cry, laugh, and feel emotions they never knew existed. Marcus stood backstage, checking his reflection in the mirror. His designer suit fit perfectly and his hair was styled to perfection. He smiled at himself knowing that in just 30 minutes thousands of voices would be screaming his name. His manager rushed over with a clipboard, going over the final details of the evening's performance. Meanwhile, in the corner of the theater's lobby, a woman named Eleanor Chen sat quietly on a wooden bench. She wore a simple gray dress that had seen better days, and her shoes were scuffed from years of wear. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a worn leather bag on her lap. Inside that bag was sheet music, yellowed with age and covered in handwritten notes. Eleanor had been a piano teacher for 40 years, working in a small school on the outskirts of the city. She had saved for months to afford a ticket to tonight's show, sitting in the cheapest seat at the very back of the hall. The announcement came over the speakers, asking all guests to take their seats. Eleanor stood slowly, her knees aching from arthritis, and made her way into the auditorium. She climbed the stairs to the upper balcony, so high up that the stage looked like a distant postage stamp, but she didn't mind. Music was music no matter where you sat. The lights dimmed and the crowd erupted in applause. Marcus strode onto the stage with the confidence of a man who owned the world. He grabbed the microphone and flashed his $1,000,000 smile. The first song began, and his voice filled every corner of the massive theater. It was powerful, controlled, and beautiful. Eleanor closed her eyes and let the music wash over her. After 3 songs, Marcus paused to address the audience. He loved these moments, connecting with his fans, making them laugh. He walked to the edge of the stage, his eyes scanning the crowd. Then he announced something unexpected. To celebrate this special evening, he wanted to invite someone from the audience to play the piano while he sang. It would be spontaneous, unrehearsed, a moment of pure musical magic. The crowd went wild with excitement. Hands shot up everywhere. People shouted and waved, desperate to be chosen. Marcus grinned and pointed randomly into the upper balcony, his finger landing in Eleanor's direction. A spotlight swung upward, and after a moment of confusion, it found her. Eleanor's eyes widened in shock. Her heart hammered in her chest. The people around her were pointing and encouraging her to go down. She shook her head, terrified, but the crowd began to chant. The theater staff appeared at her row, smiling and gesturing for her to follow them. Eleanor's legs felt like jelly as she stood. She clutched her bag tightly and began the long descent down the stairs, her mind racing. She had played piano her entire life, had taught countless students, but she had never performed in front of thousands of people. She had never even performed in front of hundreds. As she reached the stage, Marcus extended his hand to help her up the steps. Up close, he was even more handsome than he appeared in magazines. But when he got a good look at Eleanor, his expression changed. He had expected someone young, stylish, someone who would add to the glamour of the evening. Instead, here was this elderly woman in her plain dress looking absolutely terrified. Marcus took the microphone and made a comment that drew laughter from the crowd. He asked Eleanor if she knew how to play piano, his tone slightly mocking, as if doubting that someone like her could handle the instrument on his stage. Eleanor's cheeks flushed red, but she nodded quietly. Her voice was too soft to be heard without a microphone, so Marcus leaned in and asked her to speak up. She cleared her throat and said yes. She had played piano for many years. The audience chuckled at the awkward exchange. Marcus gestured grandly toward the beautiful grand piano at center stage, telling Eleanor to take a seat. He announced to the crowd that they were about to witness something special, though his sarcastic tone suggested he didn't believe his own words. He chose a song, one of his most popular ballads, and told Eleanor to just follow along as best she could. He would carry the performance, he assured everyone with a wink. Eleanor walked slowly to the piano bench and sat down. Her hands were shaking as she placed them on the keys. The cool ivory felt familiar beneath her fingers, like greeting an old friend. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. The crowd grew quiet, waiting. Some people felt sorry for the old woman who was clearly out of her depth. Others had their phones out, ready to record what would surely be an embarrassing moment. Marcus counted off, and Eleanor's fingers touched the keys. The first notes rang out across the silent theater, and something incredible happened. The sound that came from that piano was not the hesitant amateur playing everyone expected. It was pure, crystal clear, and absolutely breathtaking. Eleanor's hands moved across the keys with a grace and confidence that seemed impossible just moments before. Her fingers danced through complex runs and delicate arpeggios that even professional pianists would struggle to execute. Marcus, who had been standing confidently with the microphone raised to his lips, actually missed his cue to start singing. He stood frozen, staring at Eleanor in complete shock. The music she was creating was not just technically perfect, it was emotional, powerful, and deeply moving. She was not simply playing the notes, she was telling a story with every chord and every phrase. The entire theater had fallen into a stunned silence. Marcus Wellington, who had performed in front of millions and shared stages with the greatest musicians in the world, found himself completely unprepared for what was happening. He had expected to carry this performance, to shine while some nervous amateur struggled through the accompaniment. Instead, he was witnessing something extraordinary. Eleanor's eyes remained closed as her hands moved across the keyboard. She was no longer in the Harmony Theater surrounded by thousands of strangers. In her mind, she was back in her tiny apartment playing the old upright piano that had belonged to her mother. She was remembering every student she had taught, every recital she had attended, every quiet evening spent perfecting her craft when no one was watching. All those years of dedication, of love for music, were pouring out through her fingertips. The melody she played was the same song Marcus had chosen, but she had transformed it into something new. She added harmonies that the original recording never had, inserted unexpected chord progressions that somehow made perfect sense, and brought out emotional depths that even Marcus had never considered. Her arrangement was sophisticated, complex, and utterly beautiful. Marcus finally remembered that he was supposed to be singing. He lifted the microphone and began, but for the first time in his career he felt inadequate. His voice, which usually dominated any performance, now had to match the incredible artistry coming from the piano. He found himself actually working, really listening, adjusting his phrasing to complement what Eleanor was creating. It was not his show anymore. It was theirs. The audience sat motionless. People who had been ready to laugh at an old woman's embarrassment now found tears streaming down their faces. The music was so powerful, so genuine, that it reached into their hearts and touched something deep inside. Phones that had been raised to capture a funny moment were now recording what everyone instinctively knew was something special, something they would want to remember forever. As the song built toward its climax, Eleanor's playing became even more passionate. Her fingers flew across the keys with impossible speed and precision. She executed a series of runs that descended down the entire length of the keyboard like a waterfall of sound, then brought the melody back with a gentleness that made the whole theater hold its breath. Marcus, caught up in the moment, sang better than he had in years. He was not performing anymore. He was feeling. The final chord rang out, held by Eleanor's foot on the sustain pedal, letting it fade naturally into silence. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. The theater was so quiet that you could hear the air conditioning humming in the background. Then, as if a dam had burst, the entire audience leaped to their feet. The roar of applause was deafening. People were shouting, crying, clapping until their hands hurt. Eleanor opened her eyes slowly, as if waking from a beautiful dream. She looked out at the standing ovation with confusion and disbelief. Her hands were still resting on the keys, trembling again, but this time not from fear. Marcus stood beside the piano, his mouth slightly open, his carefully maintained stage presence completely abandoned. He was clapping too, staring at Eleanor like he was seeing her for the first time. Someone in the front row shouted for an encore. The cry was picked up by others, and soon the entire theater was chanting. Eleanor shook her head, overwhelmed, but Marcus knelt beside the piano bench. He spoke to her without the microphone, his voice quiet and sincere. He asked her to play one more song, anything she wanted. He said he would be honored to sing with her again. Eleanor looked at him, saw the genuine awe in his eyes, and felt something shift inside her. She nodded. Her shaking hands returned to the keys, and she began to play a piece that she had written herself decades ago. It was a composition she had never shared with anyone except her students, a melody that she had created during the loneliest period of her life after her husband had passed away. She had poured all her grief, all her love and all her hope into this music. Marcus listened for a few moments, learning the melody, and then began to improvise lyrics. His words spoke of loss and remembrance, of finding light in darkness, of the enduring power of love. It was not a polished performance. He made up the words as he went, sometimes pausing to find the right phrase, but that rawness made it more powerful. This was not a famous singer performing for his fans. This was one musician connecting with another, creating something beautiful in the moment. The audience swayed gently, many with their eyes closed, lost in the music. In the upper balcony where Eleanor had been sitting, an elderly man wiped tears from his eyes, thinking of his late wife. In the middle section, a young woman held her mother's hand, grateful for the years they had together. Throughout the theater, the music was reaching people in personal ways, reminding them of their own stories, their own losses and loves. When the song ended this time, the applause was different. It was not the explosive roar from before, but something deeper, more reverent. People clapped steadily, many with tears still wet on their cheeks. Marcus helped Eleanor stand, and then did something that shocked everyone. He took her hand and raised it high, stepping back so that she was at the center of the stage alone. He was giving her the spotlight, acknowledging that she was the real star of this evening. Eleanor, who had spent 40 years teaching in obscurity, who had never sought fame or recognition, stood in the center of one of the world's most prestigious stages, receiving an ovation that most performers only dream about. She looked so small standing there in her simple gray dress, but in that moment she was a giant. She had shown everyone that true artistry had nothing to do with age, appearance, or fame. It came from the soul. Marcus brought the microphone to his lips and spoke to the audience. His voice was thick with emotion, completely different from the cocky, confident tone he had used at the beginning of the evening. He admitted that he had made a mistake. He had judged Eleanor before hearing her play. He had assumed that someone who looked like her could not be a serious musician. He had been wrong, and he apologized to her in front of everyone. The audience appreciated Marcus's humility. Many of them realized they had been ready to laugh at Eleanor too, had assumed the same things Marcus had. His apology was not just to her, but to everyone who had ever been underestimated or dismissed because of how they looked. Eleanor simply nodded, accepting his words with grace, and quietly made her way off the stage. She wanted to return to her seat in the balcony, to disappear back into anonymity, but the theater staff had other ideas. Marcus continued his concert, but something had changed in him. He performed his remaining songs with less showmanship and more genuine emotion. He was not trying to impress anyone anymore. He was simply sharing music. Between songs, he kept glancing toward the wings of the stage where Eleanor had exited, as if making sure she had not been a dream. When the concert ended 2 hours later, Marcus did not leave the stage immediately as he usually did. He stood at the microphone and told the audience about his journey in music. He spoke about how he had started singing in church as a child, how his grandmother had encouraged him, how he had slowly built his career through years of small gigs and rejection. But somewhere along the way, he admitted, he had lost sight of why he started. Music had become about charts, sales numbers, and maintaining his image. Tonight, an unlikely piano teacher had reminded him what music was really about. The crowd listened in rapt attention. This vulnerability from Marcus Wellington, who was known for his confidence and larger-than-life persona, was unexpected and deeply moving. He announced that he wanted to find Eleanor and talk with her more. He asked if she was still in the theater. Staff members were already searching, and after a few moments, someone located her in the lobby, still overwhelmed by what had happened. Eleanor was brought backstage after the crowd had left. She clutched her worn leather bag, looking small and tired. The adrenaline had worn off, and she just wanted to go home to her quiet apartment. But Marcus approached her with genuine warmth, thanking her again for the incredible performance. He asked if he could take her to dinner, if they could talk about music. Eleanor hesitated. She was not used to attention, and certainly not from someone as famous as Marcus Wellington, but there was something sincere in his eyes that made her agree. They went to a small cafe near the theater, one that stayed open late for the after-show crowd. Marcus had thrown a jacket over his stage clothes and wore a baseball cap, trying to avoid recognition. They sat in a corner booth, and for the first time that evening, Eleanor felt herself relax. Marcus asked about her life, her music, her teaching. Eleanor told him about growing up in a poor family where her mother cleaned houses to afford piano lessons for her. She spoke about how she had dreamed of being a concert pianist, but had never had the connections or the money to pursue that path. Instead, she had become a teacher, and over the years she had found deep satisfaction in passing on her love of music to children. Some of her students had gone on to study music in college. A few had even become professional musicians. That, she said quietly, was her real legacy. Marcus listened, truly listened in a way he had not listened to anyone in years. His life had been so full of people telling him what he wanted to hear, of conversations that were really just about business deals and opportunities. Eleanor spoke with simple honesty, with no agenda, no desire for anything from him. She was just sharing her story because he had asked. He told her about the pressure of fame, how exhausting it was to always be on, to always be perfect. He talked about the emptiness he sometimes felt despite all his success, the way music had become work rather than joy. Eleanor listened and then said something that struck him deeply. She told him that music was like love. The moment you tried to possess it, control it, or use it for something else, it slipped away. Music had to be freely given, played for its own sake, or it lost its power. They talked until the cafe staff politely indicated it was closing time. Marcus offered to have his driver take Eleanor home, but she insisted on taking the bus as she always did. He walked her to the bus stop, this world-famous singer and this unknown piano teacher, an unlikely pair on the quiet city streets. Before her bus arrived, Marcus asked if he could have her phone number. He wanted to stay in touch, he said. He had a feeling that knowing her would change his life. Eleanor wrote her number on a piece of paper from her bag, the same paper she used to write practice notes for her students. Marcus folded it carefully and put it in his pocket like it was something precious. The bus arrived, old and rumbling, such a contrast to the luxury Marcus was used to. Eleanor climbed aboard, waved once through the window, and then she was gone, disappearing into the night like Cinderella after the ball. Marcus stood at the empty bus stop for a long time, thinking about the evening. His phone was buzzing constantly in his pocket with messages from his manager, his publicist, his friends. Video clips of Eleanor's performance were already going viral on social media. Millions of people were watching and sharing, amazed by what they were seeing. But Marcus ignored his phone. He just stood there in the quiet, feeling something he had not felt in years. He felt inspired. The next morning, Marcus woke up in his luxury penthouse apartment with Eleanor on his mind. He made coffee and sat by his piano, a beautiful instrument that cost more than most people earned in a year. He realized with some shame that he had not actually played it in months. It had become decoration, something impressive for guests to see. He sat down at the bench and began to play, really play, not practicing for a performance but just exploring the music for its own sake. His fingers were rusty at first. Marcus was primarily a singer and had basic piano skills, but he had never been serious about it. Now, after watching Eleanor, he felt a desire to truly learn the instrument. He played simple melodies, making mistakes, starting over, losing track of time. His assistant knocked on the door 2 hours later, reminding him about a meeting with his record label. Marcus had completely forgotten. At the meeting, executives wanted to talk about capitalizing on the viral moment. They had ideas for bringing Eleanor on tour, creating a special duet album, turning the whole thing into a marketing campaign. Marcus listened to their pitch and then said no. This was not about business, he told them. This was personal. The executives exchanged confused glances. They were not used to Marcus turning down opportunities, especially ones that could generate so much publicity and money. Marcus left the meeting feeling frustrated but certain he had made the right choice. He pulled out the piece of paper with Eleanor's phone number and called her that afternoon. Her voice sounded surprised when she answered, as if she had not really expected to hear from him. He asked if he could visit her, if she might be willing to give him piano lessons. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, Eleanor laughed, a warm, genuine sound, and said that of course he could visit. Eleanor lived in a modest apartment building on the east side of the city, in a neighborhood that Marcus had never visited despite living in the same city for years. The building was old but well maintained, with flower boxes in some windows and children playing in the small courtyard. Marcus climbed the 3 flights of stairs to Eleanor's apartment, carrying a bouquet of flowers that suddenly felt inadequate. She opened the door with a smile, looking more relaxed than she had at the theater. Her apartment was small and cozy, filled with books and sheet music. The upright piano stood against one wall, its wood worn smooth from decades of use. Photographs covered the top of the piano, showing young students at recitals, Eleanor with her late husband, and various other precious moments captured over a lifetime. This piano was clearly loved, used every single day, unlike the neglected instrument in Marcus's penthouse. They sat at her small kitchen table first, drinking tea that Eleanor brewed in a pot that had probably been old when Marcus was born. She asked him what he hoped to learn from piano lessons, and Marcus found himself being honest in a way he rarely was with anyone. He told her that he wanted to connect with music again the way she did. He wanted to play not to impress people or to add another skill to his resume, but because it brought joy. Eleanor nodded thoughtfully and then said something that surprised him. She told him that before they started any technical lessons, he needed to remember why he fell in love with music in the first place. She asked him to tell her about the first time music made him feel something powerful. Marcus leaned back in his chair, thinking. Then he began to talk about his grandmother, about sitting in church as a little boy, about hearing the gospel choir and feeling like the music was lifting him right out of his seat. As he spoke, his eyes grew distant with memory. He remembered how his grandmother would hum while she cooked, how she told him that God gave everyone gifts and his gift was his voice. He talked about the first time he sang solo in church at age 8, how terrified he had been, how his voice had shaken on the first note. But then something had happened. The fear had melted away and he had felt pure joy, feeling the music move through him and touch the people listening. That feeling, he realized now, was what he had been chasing his whole career, but somewhere along the way he had lost it. Eleanor listened without interrupting, her weathered hands wrapped around her teacup. When he finished, she smiled and said that he had just completed his first lesson. Understanding why music mattered to him personally was more important than any technique she could teach. She stood and walked to her piano, gesturing for him to join her. She played a simple melody, just a few notes, nothing fancy. Then she asked him to play the same thing, but to think about his grandmother while he did it. Marcus sat at the old piano bench and placed his hands on the keys. They felt different from his expensive piano at home. The action was heavier, some keys stuck slightly, but there was something wonderful about them too. He played the simple melody Eleanor had shown him, thinking about his grandmother's kitchen, her humming, her unconditional love. The notes came out imperfectly, but they carried something real. Over the following weeks, Marcus visited Eleanor 3 times a week. His manager thought he had lost his mind, spending hours in a tiny apartment learning basic piano when he had a tour to prepare for and a new album to record. But Marcus did not care. These lessons with Eleanor were feeding something in his soul that had been starving. She taught him not just how to play, but how to listen, how to feel the music before trying to create it. Eleanor was a patient teacher, but also demanding. She did not care that Marcus was famous or that he had won awards. When he played without feeling, she told him so. When he got frustrated with a difficult passage, she made him slow down and play it again, focusing on each individual note. She taught him that speed and complexity meant nothing if the emotion was not there. She shared stories about her own teachers, about the classical pianists she admired, about the years of practice that had gone into developing her skill. Marcus found himself looking forward to these lessons more than his actual performances. In Eleanor's small apartment, he was not Marcus Wellington the celebrity. He was just a student learning from a master, trying to become better. He started posting less on social media, turning down some interview requests and restructuring his schedule to protect this time with Eleanor. His team worried, but Marcus felt more centered than he had in years. One afternoon, Eleanor played for him the piece she had performed at the concert, the one she had written after her husband died. She explained the story behind it, how each section represented different stages of grief, how the final resolution represented acceptance and peace. As Marcus listened, he realized he was witnessing something rare, a true artist sharing not just their craft but their heart. He asked if he could write lyrics to her melody, if they could collaborate on turning it into a complete song. Eleanor was hesitant at first. This piece was deeply personal and she had never imagined it with words. But she trusted Marcus now, understood that his intentions were genuine. She agreed, but with one condition. The song could never be commercial. It would not be released as a single or promoted for sales. If they created this together, it had to be for the art itself, not for profit. Marcus agreed immediately. The fact that she even had to say it made him realize how much the music industry had changed him, how everything had become about commercial potential. They worked on the song together over several weeks. Marcus would suggest lyrics and Eleanor would play, adjusting the melody to fit the words, or Marcus would revise the lyrics to better match her musical phrases. They argued sometimes, both passionate about their artistic choices but always with respect. Eleanor taught Marcus that collaboration meant truly listening to your partner, being willing to let go of your ideas if something better emerged. The process was slow and sometimes frustrating, but also deeply rewarding. They were creating something that neither of them could have made alone. Eleanor's musical sophistication combined with Marcus's understanding of vocal melody and his gift for lyrics resulted in a song that was both complex and accessible, heartbreaking and hopeful. When they finally finished, they played it together in Eleanor's apartment, and both of them had tears in their eyes. Marcus asked if they could record it, not for release, but just to have a proper version. Eleanor agreed, and Marcus arranged for a small private recording session at a studio he trusted. When the day came, Eleanor was nervous about the professional environment, but Marcus made sure she felt comfortable. The sound engineer was someone Marcus had worked with for years, someone who understood that this was not a typical commercial project. The recording session was magical. Eleanor sat at the studio's grand piano, her fingers dancing across the keys with the same grace and power she had shown at the concert. Marcus sang with more vulnerability than he had ever allowed himself to display on his commercial recordings. His voice cracked in places, wavered in others, but those imperfections made the performance more human, more real. The engineer, who had recorded hundreds of tracks with famous artists, later said it was the most moving session he had ever witnessed. When they listened to the playback, Eleanor and Marcus sat in silence, letting the music wash over them. The song captured something profound about loss and healing, about finding beauty in sadness, about the resilience of the human heart. Marcus knew that this was the best work he had ever done, even though no one except a few trusted people would ever hear it. That knowledge brought him a sense of peace and satisfaction that no platinum record had ever provided. Word about Marcus's transformation was spreading through the music industry. Other artists who knew him were curious about the change they saw in him. He had always been professional but somewhat distant, focused on his career above all else. Now he seemed more present, more genuinely interested in the music itself rather than the business surrounding it. Some thought he was having a breakdown, while others recognized that he was actually becoming healthier. Marcus began incorporating what he was learning from Eleanor into his scheduled performances. At his next concert, he spoke to the audience differently, sharing more personal stories, connecting more authentically. He simplified some of his elaborate stage productions, focusing more on the music and less on the spectacle. Some critics said he had lost his edge, but others praised the new depth and maturity in his performances. Most importantly, Marcus himself felt fulfilled in a way he had not felt in years. Eleanor continued teaching her regular students at the school, refusing offers to give interviews or make appearances. The viral video had brought her brief fame, but she had no interest in pursuing it. She was content with her quiet life, her teaching, and her music. However, she did notice that some of her students seemed more inspired after seeing her performance. Several told her that watching their teacher on that stage had made them realize that music was not just for young people, or for those seeking fame. Music was for anyone who loved it. One evening, Marcus arrived at Eleanor's apartment looking troubled. He sat at her kitchen table and explained a dilemma. His record label was pressuring him to release a new album, but he did not want to create another collection of commercial pop songs designed to top charts. He wanted to make something meaningful, something that reflected who he was becoming, but he was afraid that such an album would disappoint his fans and damage his career. Eleanor listened carefully, then asked him a simple question. What would his grandmother tell him to do? Marcus smiled sadly at the question. His grandmother had passed away 5 years earlier, and he still missed her wisdom. But he knew exactly what she would say. She would tell him that integrity mattered more than success, that staying true to yourself was the only path to real happiness. She would remind him that his gift was meant to be used to touch people's hearts, not just to entertain them. Eleanor nodded and said that his grandmother sounded like a very wise woman. Then she told Marcus that he already knew his answer. He was just afraid to act on it. Over the next few months, Marcus began working on a new album that was completely different from anything he had done before. He wrote songs about real experiences, real emotions, about his journey back to authentic music. He incorporated piano into many of the tracks, playing the parts himself despite his still developing skills. The imperfections in his playing added character to the songs, made them feel more honest. Eleanor helped him arrange several pieces, teaching him how to structure the music to support the emotional arc of each song. His record label was confused and concerned when they heard the demos. This was not what they expected from Marcus Wellington. There were no obvious hit singles, no songs designed for radio play or streaming playlists. The whole album was quieter, more introspective, more mature. Marketing executives warned that this could be commercial suicide. Marcus listened to their concerns and then told them he was releasing the album anyway. If they did not want to support it, he would find another way to get it to his fans. The standoff lasted weeks. Marcus remained firm, willing to walk away from his contract if necessary. Finally, the label agreed to release the album, but with a much smaller promotional budget than his previous work. They were hedging their bets, expecting it to underperform. Marcus accepted their terms. He did not need a huge campaign. He just needed people to hear the music. Before the album was released, Marcus did something unexpected. He organized a small concert at Eleanor's school, performing for the students and teachers in the modest auditorium where Eleanor had spent so many years teaching. The kids sat in folding chairs, eyes wide as this famous singer performed just for them. Marcus sang several songs from the new album, and Eleanor accompanied him on the old-school piano that had missing ivories and tuning issues. The performance was rough around the edges, but it was filled with genuine joy. After the concert, Marcus sat with the students and answered their questions. One little girl asked why he was performing at their school instead of at a big fancy theater. Marcus smiled and explained that music was not about where you performed or how famous you were. Music was about connection, about sharing something real with other people. He told them about meeting Eleanor, about how she had reminded him what really mattered. The children listened, absorbing this lesson from an unlikely source. When Marcus's new album finally released, the reaction was mixed. Some longtime fans were disappointed, saying they missed his old style. Music critics were divided. Some praised his artistic growth and authenticity, while others felt the album was self-indulgent and would only appeal to a niche audience. Commercial performance was modest compared to his previous releases. The album did not produce any major hit singles, did not dominate streaming charts or radio play. But something interesting happened. The people who connected with the album connected deeply. They wrote messages to Marcus sharing how the songs had touched them, how the honesty in his lyrics had helped them through difficult times. Musicians respected the risks he had taken, the way he had prioritized artistry over commercial success. And slowly, steadily, the album found its audience, not through flashy marketing but through genuine word of mouth. Marcus realized that he was okay with having a smaller but more meaningful impact. He had spent years chasing bigger audiences, more streams, higher chart positions. Now he understood that touching one person deeply was more valuable than entertaining a million people superficially. This shift in perspective changed everything about how he approached his career and his life. He felt lighter, more content, more aligned with his true self. Eleanor watched Marcus's transformation with quiet pride. She had never set out to change his life, had only shared what she knew about music and staying true to yourself. But seeing him embrace a more authentic path brought her deep satisfaction. She continued teaching at the school, continued her simple routine, but now Marcus was woven into her life as a dear friend and dedicated student. Their weekly lessons became a treasured part of both their schedules. One winter afternoon, Eleanor was not feeling well. She had been fighting a cold for several days, and the walk to school in the freezing weather had exhausted her. Her students noticed that she seemed tired during lessons, that her usual energy was depleted. The school principal suggested she go home early and rest. Eleanor agreed reluctantly, never liking to leave work unfinished. She took the bus home, climbed the stairs to her apartment with heavy steps, and collapsed into bed. When Marcus called that evening for their usual chat, Eleanor did not answer. He tried again an hour later with the same result. Worry began to creep into his mind. Eleanor was reliable, always answered her phone, always let him know if she could not talk. He called the school and learned she had left early, not feeling well. That was enough for Marcus. He grabbed his coat and headed to her apartment, stopping only to pick up soup from a nearby restaurant. He knocked on her door repeatedly, calling her name. Finally, he heard her weak voice telling him to come in. He found her in bed, looking pale and fragile under several blankets. The apartment was cold because she had turned down the heat to save money. Marcus was immediately worried. He felt her forehead and knew she had a fever. He called his personal doctor, someone he trusted, and asked him to come immediately. Eleanor protested, saying she did not need a doctor, that it was just a cold, but Marcus insisted. The doctor arrived within an hour, examined Eleanor, and determined that she had developed pneumonia. He wanted to admit her to the hospital, but Eleanor refused. She hated hospitals, could not afford the bills, and just wanted to rest at home. Marcus and the doctor exchanged glances. Finally, Marcus made a decision. He told Eleanor that she could stay home, but only if she let him arrange for proper care. He would pay for everything, and he would not take no for an answer. Over Eleanor's protests, Marcus arranged for a private nurse to stay with her during the day, made sure she had medications delivered, and had her apartment warmed to a proper temperature. He visited every evening after his commitments, bringing food, reading to her, and sitting by her bedside. Eleanor was deeply uncomfortable with all the fuss, not used to being taken care of, not used to accepting help. But she was too weak to resist, and deep down she was touched by Marcus's concern. As Eleanor slowly recovered over the following weeks, she and Marcus talked more deeply than they ever had before. She told him about her childhood, about losing her parents young, about marrying her husband and the beautiful life they had built despite not having much money. She spoke about the daughter she had lost in childbirth years ago, a grief that had never fully healed. She explained that this was one reason why teaching had become so important to her, why every student felt like a gift, a chance to nurture a young life. Marcus shared his own vulnerabilities, talking about the loneliness of fame, the difficulty of knowing who truly cared about him versus who just wanted access to his wealth and status. He admitted that before meeting her, he had felt increasingly empty despite all his success. He confessed that some days he had wondered what the point of it all was. Eleanor listened with compassion, understanding that success did not protect anyone from pain or doubt. These conversations deepened their friendship into something profound. They had become family to each other, filling gaps in each other's lives. Marcus realized that Eleanor was the mentor and grandmother figure he had lost. Eleanor saw in Marcus the son she never had, someone to care for and guide. Their bond transcended music, though music had been the bridge that connected them. When Eleanor was finally well enough to return to teaching, Marcus organized a small celebration at her apartment. He invited some of her longtime students, now adults with families of their own, and some current students with their parents. Eleanor was overwhelmed to see so many people who cared about her, people whose lives she had touched through music. They shared stories about her patience, her dedication, her ability to see potential in every student no matter their starting skill level. One of her former students, now a music professor at a university, gave a short speech. He talked about how Eleanor had believed in him when his own parents doubted that music was a practical career. She had given him extra lessons for free when his family could not afford them. She had written him letters of recommendation, had celebrated every small victory with him. He said that he would not be where he was without her influence. As he spoke, others nodded, recognizing their own experiences in his story. Marcus watched Eleanor's face as she listened to these testimonials. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but she was smiling. This was her true reward. Not fame or money, but the knowledge that she had made a difference in people's lives. Marcus understood in that moment that this was the kind of legacy that really mattered. Not record sales or awards, but the positive impact you had on others. It was a lesson he was still learning, but Eleanor had been living it her entire life. After everyone left and they were cleaning up, Eleanor turned to Marcus and thanked him for organizing the gathering. She said it had meant more to her than he could know. Then she told him something important. She said that she was getting older. that her health was not what it used to be and that she needed to make sure her students would be taken care of if something happened to her. She asked Marcus if he would consider taking over her teaching at the school if she could no longer do it. Marcus was surprised by the request. He did not have her skills or experience, was still learning himself. But Eleanor explained that it was not about being the most skilled pianist. It was about caring, about showing up, about believing in the potential of every student. She said that Marcus had a gift for connecting with people, for making them feel seen and valued. He could continue her work in his own way. Marcus was honored by her trust and told her he would do his best if that time ever came. As winter turned to spring, Eleanor's health stabilized. She returned to her full teaching schedule, and her friendship with Marcus continued to flourish. They still had their weekly lessons, though now they often felt more like collaboration sessions between peers rather than teacher and student. Marcus had improved significantly on piano, and while he would never be a virtuoso, he could play with feeling and expression, which Eleanor had always said was more important than technical perfection. Marcus's career had also stabilized in a new way. He was no longer the biggest name in pop music, no longer dominating charts or selling out the largest venues. But he had a loyal following of fans who appreciated his artistic evolution. He performed in smaller, more intimate venues, places where he could actually see the audience's faces and connect with them personally. He collaborated with other artists who prioritized authenticity over commercialism. He felt successful in a way that was deeper and more satisfying than anything he had experienced at the peak of his fame. 2 years after that unforgettable night at the Harmony Theater, Marcus received a call from a television producer. They wanted to create a documentary about meaningful connections in the music world, and they had heard about his friendship with Eleanor. They wanted to tell their story. Marcus was hesitant, protective of Eleanor's privacy and the sanctity of what they had built together. He told the producer he would think about it and discuss it with Eleanor. When Marcus brought up the idea during their next lesson, Eleanor was quiet for a long time. She had spent her entire life avoiding the spotlight, content with her quiet existence, but then she thought about all the young musicians who might be inspired by their story, all the people who felt invisible or undervalued, who might be encouraged to keep pursuing their passions. She also thought about the importance of showing that artistry had nothing to do with age or fame. After much consideration, she agreed, but only if they could maintain control over how the story was told. The documentary team spent several months filming. They captured Eleanor teaching at the school, Marcus taking his piano lessons in her small apartment, and the two of them working on music together. They interviewed Eleanor's students, both past and present, gathering stories about her impact on their lives. They filmed Marcus performing at one of his intimate concerts and included footage of that viral moment at the Harmony Theater that had started everything. They were careful to tell the story with respect and authenticity, focusing on the genuine friendship and mutual transformation rather than creating artificial drama. During the filming process, Marcus proposed an idea to Eleanor. He wanted to establish a music scholarship fund in her name, something that would help students from low-income families afford music lessons and instruments. Eleanor was moved by the gesture but insisted that the fund should not just be in her name. It should be named after Marcus's grandmother, too, the woman who had first encouraged his musical gift. And so the Wellington Chen Music Foundation was born, funded by Marcus's contributions and supported by donations from others who believed in making music, education accessible to everyone. The documentary premiered at a film festival and received overwhelming positive response. It won several awards for its heartwarming portrayal of an unlikely friendship and its message about authenticity in art. When it was released more widely, millions of people watched and were moved by Eleanor and Marcus's story. Eleanor, who had spent decades in obscurity, suddenly found herself recognized on the street. People would stop her to thank her for inspiring them, to tell her that seeing her story had encouraged them to pursue their own passions regardless of age or circumstances. Marcus watched Eleanor handle this unexpected attention with the same grace and humility she brought to everything. She never let it change her. She still took the bus to school, still taught her regular students with the same dedication, still lived in her modest apartment. When reporters asked about her sudden fame, she would smile and say that nothing important had changed. She was still just a piano teacher who loved music and her students. That was all she had ever wanted to be. The Wellington Chen Music Foundation grew beyond anything they had initially imagined. Music stores donated instruments. Professional musicians volunteered their time to give master classes. Music schools offered scholarships. Within 2 years, over 300 children from low-income families were receiving music education through the foundation. Eleanor insisted on reviewing scholarship applications herself, reading every essay, looking for students who demonstrated genuine passion regardless of their current skill level. One spring afternoon, Eleanor was teaching a particularly promising student, a 10-year-old boy from a struggling family who showed remarkable natural talent. As she guided his hands on the keys, showing him how to bring out the emotion in a simple melody, she felt a deep sense of contentment. This was what it was all about, this moment right here, passing on the love of music to the next generation. The fame, the documentary, the foundation were all wonderful, but this connection with a student, this pure transfer of knowledge and passion, was what mattered most. Marcus arrived later that afternoon for his lesson, but they ended up just talking and playing music together as they often did. Eleanor played a new composition she had been working on, and Marcus suggested lyrics for it. They laughed together when the words did not quite fit the melody, adjusted and tried again until something beautiful emerged. As the sun set outside Eleanor's window, casting golden light across her worn piano, Marcus felt overwhelming gratitude for that night at the Harmony Theater when he had been arrogant enough to mock a woman before, hearing her play. He thought about how that single moment of being proven wrong had changed the entire trajectory of his life. If Eleanor had not been as talented as she was, if she had fumbled through that song like he expected, he would have continued on his path of empty success. He would still be performing without feeling, chasing numbers instead of meaning, slowly losing himself in the machinery of fame. Instead, she had shattered his assumptions and opened his eyes to what really mattered. Eleanor looked at Marcus as he sat at her piano, his fingers moving across the keys with growing confidence, his face peaceful in a way it had not been when they first met. She thought about how teaching him had reminded her that it was never too late for anyone to change, to grow, to choose a different path. She had spent decades teaching children, but teaching Marcus had been different, watching an adult who had lost his way find it again. It had renewed her faith in the possibility of transformation at any age. As years passed, their friendship remained the anchor in both their lives. Eleanor eventually had to reduce her teaching schedule as her health declined with age, but she never stopped completely. Marcus made sure she had everything she needed, that she could age with dignity and comfort. He continued his career on his own terms, making music that mattered to him, touring when he wanted to and taking time off when he needed it. He never forgot the lesson Eleanor had taught him on that stage, that true artistry came from the soul, not from appearances or expectations. The Wellington Chen Music Foundation continued to grow, eventually helping thousands of students across the country. Some of those students went on to become professional musicians. Others simply carried their love of music into their everyday lives. But all of them learned that music was a gift to be shared, not hoarded or used for selfish gain. They learned that dedication and passion mattered more than natural talent, that age was no barrier to artistry, and that the greatest success was touching hearts rather than topping charts. On the 5th anniversary of their first meeting, Marcus organized a small concert at the Harmony Theater, the place where it had all begun. Eleanor played piano while Marcus sang, performing the song they had written together about loss and healing. The theater was full, but not with the usual crowd of fans screaming for a celebrity. Instead, it was filled with music teachers, students, scholarship recipients, and people whose lives had been touched by their story. The performance was not technically perfect, but it was filled with such genuine emotion that many in the audience wept. After the final note faded, Marcus and Eleanor stood together at the center of the stage, hand in hand. They looked out at the audience, then at each other, and smiled. No words were needed. They both understood that they had found something rare and precious, a friendship that had transformed them both, that had reminded them why music mattered, that had shown them the power of staying true to yourself, even when the whole world seemed to be pulling you in different directions. Eleanor was 85 years old now, her hands showing the effects of arthritis, her steps slower than they used to be, but her spirit was as vibrant as ever, her passion for music and teaching undimmed by time. Marcus was no longer the brash young superstar who had mocked an elderly woman on stage. He had become someone deeper, wiser, more connected to what truly mattered. And as they took their final bow together, both knew that this journey they had shared, this unlikely partnership between a famous singer and an unknown piano teacher, had been the greatest success of both their lives.